Hi, where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments.
The air inside the heavily reinforced underground pump chamber of Dewatering Sector 9 was completely saturated with a dense, freezing mist, a hyperpressurized vapor created by the constant, aggressive shearing of subterranean water flows against high-capacity tungsten carbide valve gates. It carried the heavy, primordial smell of ancient dolomitic silt, oxidized iron pyrites, and the distinct, sulfurous sting of deep-crust brine that had been locked away from the surface for 300 million years. The environment was a cold, dripping cavern of reinforced shotcrete, dominated by three 6,000-horsepower multi-stage centrifugal drainage pumps that produced a terrifying, low-frequency acoustic thrumming. This vibration did not pass through the air. It traveled directly through the solid granitic floor, setting the heavy steel casing strings and manual pressure recorders into a permanent skeletal rattle. I sat on a heavy, iron-reinforced tool chest near the main suction manifold. My oilskin grease jacket, thick, heavily discolored by decades of exposure to abrasive mineral sludges and bearing the jagged tears of high-pressure pipe blowouts, draped loosely over my shoulders. For 44 years, my official title within the National Mine Safety and Subsurface Hydrology Commission had been Chief Hydrodynamic Arbitrator and Senior Aquifer Pressure Analyst. In the flashy, computer-generated animation loops displayed at the Central Logistics Office of the Modern Mining Consortium, my deep-level station was treated as an expensive, slow-moving historical anchor from the early mechanical shaft-sinking era. The new private extraction operator, Apex Deep Rock Extraction, had long since transitioned to using automated downhole fiber optic piezometers, electronic acoustic borehole monitors, and cloud-based predictive fluidization software that treated an unstable, multi-layered artesian aquifer matrix at 700 meters below sea level as a simple, predictable blue grid running on an executive's desktop monitor. They genuinely believed that draining an active structural fault zone to extract deep-seated copper porphyry was nothing more than a matter of selecting an automated pump curve on a sleek dashboard and letting remote digital flow regulators manage the pressure line. But automated borehole piezometers do not calculate the microscopic structural collapse that occurs inside a saturated clay gouge zone when a sudden pressure differential forces the water to channel through hidden rock fractures. They don't hear the tiny, high-pitched metallic pinging sound inside a drilled grout curtain that indicates the solid cement barrier is beginning to leach and wash away into porous sand long before any volumetric flow variance registers on a remote control center array. I was the man who knew the exact physical weight of an undisturbed hydraulic head, the precise acoustic pitch of an overstressed casing shoe, and exactly how many millimeters a deep-level borehole casing could deflect before the phenomenon of a hydrodynamic piping failure would liquefy the stabilizing rock strata, turning an entire 2-mile-deep underground production shaft into an unstoppable, self-priming hydraulic piston. I was not a resource investment coordinator, an infrastructure asset manager, or a digital dashboard programmer. I was a physical reader of hydraulic pressure, fluid velocity, and structural friction who had spent half his life walking the dripping timber sets of deep-level mine drifts, reading the silent, catastrophic water indicators that automated telemetry was too uncalibrated to capture. My brother's son, Marcus, stood near the primary variable frequency drive enclosure, his spotless, high-visibility orange executive jacket carrying the crisp, synthetic smell of a corporate warehouse as he verified a digital flow chart on his tablet. He was 37, the regional vice president of infrastructure throughput acceleration for Apex Deep Rock, a man whose entire professional acceleration was built entirely around dewatering cycle compression, which in practical terms meant reducing the mandatory 96-hour hydrostatic stabilization period to 30 minutes. Forcing deep-level pumping stations to run past their critical cavitational limits to clear flooding faces faster and threatening veteran mine foremen with immediate administrative termination if they flagged an entire production drift due to deep well pressure anomalies. The automated hydraulic clearance from our central operations network is already certified and logged into the Federal Mining Asset Registry. Uncle Thomas, Marcus said, his voice holding the rapid, sharp cadence of an executive whose performance matrix was tied directly to clearing the deep ore bodies before the International Metal Exchange's financial quarter closed. Our downhole digital arrays checked the pore pressure across 4,000 independent points along the western footwall. The structural saturation curve is completely flat. The sector is mathematically dry. Honestly, at 80, walking the lower haulage drifts with a manual acoustic testing bar and an old mechanical flow cup just to check the casing seals is an absurd waste of your remaining physical energy. You're holding up the extraction drill schedule. He was presenting my systematic exclusion from the deep-level mine drainage management roster not as a cold corporate firing, but as a compassionate, protective retirement arrangement designed to save my aging limbs from the freezing mine drafts. This is the precise, clinical script of modern corporate liquidation. You never tell a master hydrogeologist that his ears can read the structural integrity of a water-bearing fault line more accurately than your uncalibrated software simulations. You tell him he is too fragile for the damp. The downhole digital arrays only read the electrical resistance inside the pre-drilled sensor tubes. Marcus, I said, my voice low, holding the flat, gravelly weight of a man who spent 40 years speaking over the deafening roar of high-pressure mine drainage turbines. The computer doesn't see the sand migration occurring behind the main stabilization casing near the lower fault gate. The dewatering model was developed by the leading rock mechanics firm in Zurich. Thomas, he replied, sliding his tablet into his leather folder with a swift, definitive snap. We don't need an old pit boss looking at the clarity of the sump water to tell us if a grout curtain is holding anymore. We are on a 24-hour countdown to initiate the maximum velocity core extraction phase for the deep rock, 9 lower or body before the international investment audit window locks. My corporate partners and I have already finalized your enrollment package at the Pinecrest Ridges Valley Resort. It's an exclusive luxury community in the high desert with its own climate-controlled indoor gardens, heated stone walks, and absolute isolation from industrial mining sectors. What Marcus completely left out of his fast-paced professional summary was the fact that his advancement to Senior Vice President of Continental Resource Logistics was entirely contingent on clearing the lower production drifts before the end of the fiscal month, and that his private investment syndicate had already shorted the stock of our independent safety testing laboratory to clear the path for a fully automated mine conversion the moment my regulatory inspection office was shut down. The structural friction between my physical experience in the drifts and my nephew's digital acceleration schedule reached a critical threshold exactly 10 days later, during the production drawdown of the main hydroconduit 9 Gamma. The infrastructure component was a massive, 24-inch diameter thick-walled steel drainage column lined with advanced basalt wear jackets designed to lift hyperabrasive, sand-laden mine water under a vertical static pressure of 80 atmospheres from the deep pump station straight to the surface treatment reservoirs. To the regional operations office, it was a high-revenue utility asset that needed to be brought up to full flow velocity within 12 hours to prevent the lower high-grade mining stopes from flooding. To Marcus, it was the final physical benchmark that needed to be verified before the corporate directors arrived for the public ribbon-cutting ceremony at the mine's new automated lower-level extraction wing. He came down to the flooded concrete pad of Sector 9 during a heavy, freezing Tuesday afternoon winter storm, his thin-soled dress, shoes slipping instantly on the slick, mud-encrusted iron grating near the high-pressure suction valves. He was accompanied by a man named Vance, the newly appointed Commissioner of Regional Resource Infrastructure Compliance, a 35-year-old business logistics graduate whose understanding of deep-level fluid mechanics was entirely limited to what he had memorized from data simulation slides during his management courses. Mr. Thorne, Vance said, his voice carrying the sharp, defensive pitch of a corporate bureaucrat whose schedule was being disrupted by a laboratory technicality. We've reviewed the electronic readouts from the conduit's primary hydrostatic gauges. The pressure lines are completely green. The automated flow control shows zero velocity drop along the vertical intake. We need you to sign the formal hydrodynamic clearance certificate so the technicians can pull the manual isolation clamps and let the automated system ramp the turbine drainage pumps up to full capacity. He held out a sleek, plastic-shelled clipboard with a digital signature application open, a legal document that would completely clear Apex DPROC of any industrial liability if the main pipeline collapsed or the deep water column caused a catastrophic structural hydraulic shock wave along the shaft infrastructure. The digital vacuum sensors are reading the electrical resistance inside the electronic sensor heads. Mr. Vance, I said, keeping my hands buried inside the thick, mud-stained pockets of my canvas inspector's coat. They aren't reading the internal gasification and sand scour occurring behind the main grout barrier near the lower fault gate. The storm outside isn't the problem. The internal rock erosion is. Marcus stepped directly into the gap between me and the compliance commissioner, his teeth grinding with frustration, his voice rising to a shout to be heard over the deafening, high-pitched mechanical howl of the massive drainage turbines. Thomas, let's drop the old-timer folklore routine right now. The loading software calculates structural stress and checks the core integrity automatically based on electronic microsensors. Every hour this pipeline remains throttled back costs the Syndicate $60,000 in delayed tonnage penalties. Your refusal to sign this certificate is a direct violation of your regulatory mandate. If that screen isn't signed by 5 o'clock, Vance and I will execute an emergency administrative override under the Resource Infrastructure Acceleration Act. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes wild with a cold, financial desperation that contained no trace of family loyalty. We know what this is about, old man. You're terrified that this entire facility is going to run on automated switches without your signature on a piece of paper. But your tenure is finished. If you don't clear this conduit, we will have company security guards escort you out of the gate for industrial obstruction, and your retirement insurance package will be forwarded to the State Compliance Board for an immediate forensic audit. He leaned down until his hard hat pressed against mine. The Pinecrest Ridges Valley Resort doesn't take residents with an open state investigation, Thomas. You'll be spending your winter in a state-run tenement down by the freight yards where the walls are coated in diesel soot and the floor vibrates every time a coal car rolls past. Sign the clearance and let the pumps roll. The final confrontation did not take place on the muddy concrete of the pump pad. It occurred 48 hours later inside the ultramodern, glass-walled conference suite of the Global Resource and Industrial Underwriter Syndicate on the 71st floor of the Vanguard Horizon Tower, a building that looked down onto the city center like a giant, reflective obelisk. Marcus had organized an emergency technical arbitration hearing, using a corporate transport service to bring me there as if I were an obsolete piece of mining machinery being brought before a board of corporate bankruptcy receivers. Chairman Geller, the senior industrial risk underwriter whose global fund had guaranteed $400 million against the completion of the deep water mining project, sat at the head of the long obsidian table. Next to him sat Marcus, his laptop open to a high-speed simulation loop titled Project DPROC, hydrostatic flow optimization, and Commissioner Vance, who was quietly reviewing a stack of pre-signed environmental waivers. Mr. Thorne, Chairman Geller began, his voice low, dry, and carrying the absolute emotional coldness of a man who viewed human life as a simple variable in a compound interest table. Your nephew has presented a highly detailed, data-supported case for the immediate acceleration of the Conduit 9 Gamma dewatering loop. The digital metrics indicate that the internal pressures are well within safe margins. Your continued refusal to sign off on the safety certificate appears to be based entirely on undocumented personal intuition and outmoded manual testing methodologies. The monitor on the boardroom wall flashed a 3D animation of the underground pipe network, showing the blue drainage water flowing smoothly out of the deep levels through digital channels into the surface treatment plants. The interface glowing with a bright, reassuring green that indicated a perfectly balanced hydrodynamic system. The simulation is running on the assumption that the subterranean grout curtain is maintaining an absolute hydraulic isolation under structural load. Chairman, I said, rising slowly from my chair without using the armrests. I didn't reach for an external hard drive. Instead, I reached into my old leather rigger's case and placed 3 small, heavy structural core samples onto the polished surface of the table. Each stone cylinder was 6 inches long, its hard dolomite matrix completely honeycombed and drilled into a fragile, sponge-like network by high-velocity water erosion. In March of 1995, I said, my voice cutting through the room's silent air conditioning with the absolute clarity of an iron yard whistle. The sister system of this conduit, the Sector 4 drainage line, attempted to dewater a lower or body under identical pressure parameters. The company computers at the time stated the grout barriers were fully functional. But the computers didn't calculate what happens when a deep-level fault zone contains trace sand layers that introduce abrasive scour into a structural fracture surrounding a pipe carrying fluid at 80 atmospheres of static head. They didn't calculate the physical phenomenon known as subterranean hydrodynamic piping. Marcus slammed his hand onto the table, the glass cups rattling against the granite trim. The 1995 incident involved old first-generation Portland cements, Thomas. Sector 9 uses an advanced microfine polyurethane grout matrix that was formulated and certified by our chemical team last month. The grout was certified in a static test cell. Marcus, I replied, looking directly at Chairman Geller, whose eyes had shifted from the simulation screen down to the sponge-like rock cores on his table. Your extraction crew didn't realize that the blasting sequence yesterday morning didn't just clear the copper face, it cracked the structural seal on the main hydraulic barrier. That internal erosion on those rock cores isn't normal geological wear. It's the result of rapid, high-velocity fluid piping. Your automated system is reading the line's output as stable because the pressure at the pumps is temporarily holding. It's not a functioning drainage circuit. It's a hydrostatic time bomb. I pointed out the window toward the gray silhouette of the mountain range in the distance. Right now, the deep groundwater leaking behind that compromised grout curtain is expanding its erosion path at an exponential geometric rate as it scours out the stabilizing silt. Because your sensors are calibrated to read internal pipe pressure rather than external rock saturation levels along the shaft walls, your software thinks the system is balanced. The moment you force those high-pressure drainage turbines to full output capacity, the sudden drawdown shock wave won't clear the drift. It will cause an instantaneous liquefaction event inside the fault zone. The resulting water column will violently collapse the entire 20-foot wide production shaft, crushing the lower extraction levels under millions of tons of liquid sludge, drowning the entire lower production shift and destroying the mining complex permanently. In the science of deep-level hydrogeology, there is an absolute physical boundary known as the critical fluidization threshold, the exact hydrodynamic limit where compressed groundwater forces its way through a granular matrix, completely neutralizing the structural friction of the rock and turning solid geological formations into an unstoppable, liquid slurry within a fraction of a second. It is a physical reality that cannot be negotiated by an executive board vote, amended by an insurance syndicate, or hidden behind a corporate presentation on a screen. I pulled a small, water-damaged yellow ledger from my inside pocket, the original 1995 deep-level mining disaster and subsurface hydrology registry, certified by the National Bureau of Economic Security and bearing the permanent restrictive stamp hydrostatic critical exclusion number 911 barrier. It was a physical document that existed entirely outside the company's cloud network, an original federal safety mandate that could not be deleted by an IT update or overridden by a municipal development waiver. Under Section 34 of the Federal Mine Security Act, I said, placing the ledger directly over Marcus's laptop keyboard, any deep-level pumping system that exhibits evidence of grout curtain degradation or sandpiping during an active drilling sequence cannot be granted an international safety clearance for commercial extraction without a full structural core drilling and physical cement injection validation along the distribution barrier. The exclusion on this specific hydrogeologic zone is still active, gentlemen. I never cleared it, and the Federal Standards Board never rescinded it. The boardroom became completely devoid of sound, save for the faint, high-altitude creak of the glass wall as a fresh wind gust hit the building. Chairman Geller leaned forward, his manicured fingers lifting the old manual from the keyboard. He flipped to the page with the crimson stamp, his eyes scanning the technical signatures from 31 years ago with a cold, absolute focus. "Is this safety exclusion active in the National Regulatory Archive, Vance?" Geller asked, his voice dropping into a razor-thin whisper that signaled the immediate termination of his professional patience. Vance's face had turned an ashen, translucent white. He was tapping his tablet screen with desperate speed, his fingers slipping on the smooth glass. I don't have access to the pre-digital regulatory files from the central office. Our system, it only displays the active commercial operational updates from 2023 onward. The physical laws of fluid mechanics don't live in your system, Vance, I said, taking my manual back from the insurance chairman's desk. They live in the safe at the Sector 9 office. If your corporate team forces those drainage pumps tonight before that exclusion is legally resolved, your insurance syndicate will be fully liable for every life lost and every dollar of the physical asset when that shaft collapses. Chairman Geller closed his leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive thud that sounded like a pistol shot in the silent boardroom. The insurance clearance for the Apex DPROC project is formally revoked effective immediately. Shut down the drainage pumps. Get the grouting crews back on the floor and isolate that fault zone before the footwall liquefies. Marcus stood up, his face a distorted mask of panic and corporate fury, his executive composure completely shattered. "Uncle Thomas, you old lunatic, you've ruined us. The investment syndicate. They will call the primary manufacturing bonds tomorrow morning. We've already leveraged our entire corporate capital account against the completion timeline. If that certificate is frozen, we're completely bankrupt by Friday. I didn't leverage your capital against an unverified grout barrier. Marcus, your own arrogance did," I said, packing my eroded dolomite cores back into my case. "You assumed that because an old pit boss spent his life reading the water patterns in a concrete bunker, his knowledge was obsolete and his codebooks were garbage. But a hydrogeologist's job is to read the reality of the pressure gradient, not the profit of the buyer. The financial collapse of Apex DPROC extraction was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden, vertical liquidation that erased the company from the National Mining Registry within 90 days. The Federal Mining Board and the International Metal Exchange withdrew their multi-million-dollar purchasing agreements within 48 hours of a federal engineering team confirming the massive fluidization and grout wall erosion along the Sector 9 drainage line. The cost of running an emergency core drilling program, rebuilding the stabilization curtain walls, and remitting the production drifts exceeded $54 million, a capital expenditure that made the entire deepwater mining project completely toxic to institutional investors. Without the expected delivery bonus from the production timeline to clear their outstanding secondary credit lines, Marcus's partnership filed for Chapter 7 liquidation before the winter snow had closed the mountain transport routes. His luxury corporate sedan was towed out of his suburban driveway in mid-January, a quiet financial repossession witnessed only by the local municipal sanitation workers who watched the bank's agents load it onto a flatbed truck in the gray morning slush. Marcus called the drainage bunker house line once during the spring thaw, his voice hollow, flat, and completely stripped of his former corporate cadence. He spoke for less than 2 minutes, asking if I could use my standing as a lifetime member of the Mine Inspectors Union to help him secure an entry-level position as an assistant valve seal checker on the low-priority agricultural drainage ditches in the Southern Flats. I told him that the agricultural districts were using automated drainage gates now, and that the computers had no operational space for an executive who didn't understand how to read the physical saturation of a rock line. I was not moved to the Pinecrest Ridges Valley Resort. The National Safety Board quietly canceled my retirement notice the following Monday afternoon. They realized that without my specific physical understanding of subsurface fluid dynamics and the undigitized drainage acts, They couldn't certify a single extraction terminal in the mining sector without risking a structural disaster that would void their national insurance policy. They created a permanent position for me, Chief Hydrodynamic Arbitrator and Subsurface Security Custodian for the Federal District. My salary is now paid directly out of the nation's core industrial security account. More than enough to keep my office warm through the winter storms without ever needing to look at a corporate senior community brochure. I still sit on my high steel stool in the observation room of Sector 9, watching the digital telemetry lines flicker on the automated piezometer screens below. The drainage conduits operate under my supervision now. Their hydrostatic pressures cross-checked every morning against my manual barographs, and the deep water leaves the floor at a slow, measured pace, its transfer velocity kept strictly below the critical threshold until the underground rock matrix has found its perfect, permanent balance within the curtain. The younger generation operates under the dangerous, modern delusion that technology is the same thing as control, and that a three-dimensional animation can force the fluid to ignore the laws of physics. They believe that success is a matter of simply accelerating the schedule and erasing the manual safety margins of the past to maximize a quarterly return. But they do not understand that the deep water does not look at your investment targets, and the hydrostatic pressure does not care about your promotion timeline. Every commercial empire, every resource fortune, and every family dynamic is ultimately subject to the physical limits of the material below. My nephew thought he was optimizing a slow asset when he tried to clear away my experience and force me out of the pump station. He didn't have the functional capacity to understand that the old, quiet man he viewed as an operational bottleneck was the only structural anchor keeping his entire world from being torn apart by the weight of the expanding water. In the end, he wasn't defeated by a family feud or an elaborate legal conspiracy. He was simply broken by the unyielding laws of the critical fluidization threshold he refused to believe was real.